Sustained burst into the Dornier's port engine. The bomber nosed down and crashed near Maidstone, its crew killed on impact. Walker returned to base with his Hurricane resembling Swiss cheese. Yet it flew perfectly. The ground crew passed the fabric that evening, and Walker flew the same aircraft next morning. The statistical reality of the battle became clearer as records were compiled in subsequent months. Fighter Command's operational records, now preserved at the National Archives in Kew, show that Hurricane squadrons destroyed approximately 1,360 enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain, while Spitfire squadrons accounted for roughly 930 kills. This meant Hurricanes claimed nearly 60% of all confirmed victories, despite often receiving less favorable tactical assignments and rarely appearing in propaganda materials. The reasons for this disparity were multiple. First, simple numbers: there were more Hurricanes available. Second, tactical doctrine directed Hurricanes primarily against bombers, which were easier targets than the nimble Bf-109 fighters that Spitfires engaged. Third, the Hurricane's stability as a gun platform meant that average pilots could achieve hits more consistently than in the lighter, more sensitive Spitfire. Finally, Hurricane squadrons often operated closer to the bomber's typical altitude, reducing climb time and allowing more interceptions per sortie. October 1940. As autumn arrived and German bomber raids increasingly shifted to night operations, the daylight phase of the Battle of Britain drew to a close. The statistics were being tallied, and an awkward truth emerged for the Air Ministry's propaganda department. Their carefully cultivated Spitfire mythology bore little resemblance to actual combat. Results: Flight Lieutenant James Lacey of No. 501 Squadron had accumulated 28 confirmed kills, making him one of the highest-scoring pilots of the battle. He flew Hurricanes. Squadron leader Archie McKellar of No. 605 Squadron claimed 21 victories, all in Hurricanes. Wing Commander John Mungo Park scored 14 confirmed kills without ever flying a Spitfire. These men, and dozens like them, had become lethal aerial warriors in the unglamorous Hurricane. Yet the British public could barely name them, while Spitfire pilots received invitations to social events and newspaper interviews. The disparity troubled some senior commanders. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, whose No. 11 group had borne the brunt of fighting, understood perfectly well that his Hurricane squadrons had done the heaviest lifting. In an internal memorandum dated October 24, 1940, preserved in Park's papers at the Churchill Archives Center, he wrote, "The Hurricane units have performed magnificently and deserve far greater recognition than they have received. While I understand the importance of maintaining public morale through celebration of the Spitfire's undeniable qualities, we must not allow this to obscure the Hurricane's decisive contribution." German intelligence finally began to grasp what their bomber crews had been reporting for months. A Luftwaffe assessment document from November 1940, captured after the war and now held in Allied archives, contains a revealing passage. Previous intelligence estimates significantly understated the numerical superiority and combat effectiveness of the Hawker Hurricane. While the Supermarine Spitfire represented the primary focus of our tactical planning, post-operational analysis suggests that Hurricane-equipped squadrons accounted for the majority of our bomber losses. Future operations must prioritize the destruction of Hurricane units. This belated recognition came too late to affect German strategy. Hitler had already postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority, and that failure rested significantly on the wings of aircraft they had systematically underestimated. The Hurricane, dismissed as obsolescent by some German analysts who fixated on the Spitfire's superior specifications, had proven that combat effectiveness involved far more than maximum speed and rate of climb. Individual Hurricane pilots began receiving recognition as the immediate crisis passed. Flight Lieutenant Eric Nicholson received the Victoria Cross for continuing to attack a German bomber, even while his Hurricane burned around him. Squadron leader Tom Gleave, still undergoing painful treatment for his burns, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Yet these individual honors could not dispel the broader public perception that Spitfires had won the battle. Newsreel footage continued showing predominantly Spitfires. Ministry of Information posters featured Spitfire silhouettes. The propaganda machine, having invested heavily in the Spitfire narrative, found it impossible to reverse course without appearing to have misled the public. November 1940. The Battle of Britain officially ended as Hitler redirected Luftwaffe resources toward the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Fighter command had prevailed, though at significant cost. 544 aircrew killed and 422 wounded. Nearly 1,800 aircraft had been destroyed on both sides. Britain survived her most desperate moment, and the hurricane had been the primary instrument of that survival. The Air Ministry faced a peculiar problem in the battle's aftermath: how to acknowledge the hurricane's decisive role without undermining the Spitfire mythology that had proven so effective for public morale. The solution was characteristic British. Compromise issued general praise for fighter command while allowing the existing public preference for Spitfires to continue uncorrected. This decision, while politically expedient, would distort historical understanding for decades. Winston Churchill's famous speech declaring "never in the field of human conflict" was so much owed by so many to Sophie made no distinction between aircraft types. Yet popular interpretation assumed he referred primarily to Spitfire pilots. Churchill himself flew in a hurricane in May 1941 to experience what the pilots had endured, suggesting he understood the aircraft's importance. But his public statements maintained careful ambiguity. The mythology had become too powerful to challenge. Hurricane production continued throughout the war, ultimately totaling 14,533 aircraft, compared to 20,351 Spitfires. Yet the hurricane's combat career increasingly shifted to other theaters and roles. In North Africa, hurricanes carrying bombs and rockets proved devastatingly effective against German tanks. In Burma, they defended against Japanese air attacks and provided close air support for ground forces. On Malta, hurricane squadrons held the line until Spitfires arrived in sufficient numbers. The aircraft that had saved Britain became the workhorse of the empire, serving reliably in climates and conditions from Arctic Norway to tropical Singapore. German military historians, freed from wartime propaganda constraints, produced more accurate assessments. General Adolf Galland, who commanded Luftwaffe fighters during the battle, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "We made a critical error in focusing our intelligence and tactical planning on the Spitfire while underestimating the Hurricane. The sturdy Hawker fighter destroyed more of our bombers than all other cousins combined. Had we recognized this earlier and adjusted our tactics accordingly, the battle's outcome might have differed." Galland's admission highlighted a broader lesson about intelligence failures and confirmation bias. The Luftwaffe had decided the Spitfire was the primary threat based on its impressive specifications, then interpreted all subsequent information through that preconceived lens. Reports from bomber crews about devastating hurricane attacks were rationalized away or attributed to Spitfires through misidentification. This systematic error cost Germany dearly, demonstrating how even sophisticated military organizations can blind themselves to uncomfortable realities. The surviving hurricane pilots watched this historiographical distortion with varying degrees of amusement and frustration. Some, like Douglas Bader, actively worked to ensure hurricane achievements received proper recognition. Others, like Bob Doe of No. 238 Squadron, who claimed 14 victories in hurricanes, simply got on with their lives, secure in the knowledge that those who mattered, their fellow pilots and commanders, knew the truth. 21st century, more than 80 years after the Battle of Britain, historical scholarship has finally corrected the popular mythology that emerged during the war. Access to comprehensive combat records, German archives, and rigorous statistical analysis has established beyond doubt that hurricane squadrons accounted for approximately 60% of German aircraft destroyed during the battle. Yet the Spitfire remains the iconic symbol of British resistance in popular imagination. The reasons for this persistent mythology are complex and revealing. The Spitfire's elegant aesthetics made it photogenic and cinematically appealing. Its technical sophistication satisfied a public desire to believe British engineering could match German industrial prowess. Most importantly, the Spitfire arrived at a moment when Britain desperately needed symbols of hope and defiance. The aircraft fulfilled that psychological need so effectively that facts became secondary to emotional truth. Historian Dr. James Holland's research, documented in his comprehensive works on the Second World War, demonstrates the statistical reality with forensic precision. His analysis of squadron combat reports, cross-referenced with German loss records and contemporary documentation, confirms that hurricanes destroyed roughly 1,360 enemy aircraft compared to 930 by Spitfires during the crucial July to October 1940 period. This 60-40 split directly contradicted the public perception that developed during and after the war. The hurricane's relegation to secondary status in popular memory represents more than simple historical injustice. It illustrates how wartime propaganda narratives, however necessary at the time, can ossify into permanent historical mythology resistant to factual correction. The Air Ministry's decision to emphasize Spitfires served legitimate morale purposes in 1940, but the narrative proved impossible to revise once established. Subsequent generations absorbed the Spitfire myth through films, books, and commemorative materials that perpetuated the wartime propaganda long after its strategic purpose had expired. Yet the pilots who flew Hurricanes in 1940 needed no historical rehabilitation to understand their achievement. They had lived through for months of desperate combat, knowing every morning might bring death before sunset. They watched friends die, suffered wounds both physical and psychological, and persevered through exhaustion that modern observers struggle to comprehend. Whether their aircraft appeared in propaganda posters mattered little compared to the knowledge that they had held the line when holding mattered most. The last Hurricane pilots passed away in the early 21st century, taking their memories of those desperate summer days with them. Wing Commander Tom Neal, who survived 98 combat missions and Hurricanes during the battle, died in 2019 at age 97. His memoir Gun Button to Fire provides one of the most honest accounts of Hurricane combat, stripped of romanticism, but filled with respect for the aircraft that carried him through impossible odds. Neal's generation understood what historians would later confirm. The Hurricane won the Battle of Britain, while the Spitfire won the publicity battle. Modern airshows typically feature both Hurricanes and Spitfires, allowing spectators to compare them directly. The contrast remains striking: the Spitfire's grace versus the Hurricane's solid purposefulness. Yet knowledgeable observers recognize that elegance and effectiveness are not synonymous. The Hurricane's workmanlike appearance concealed qualities that mattered more in combat: reliability, survivability, and devastating firepower delivered by a stable gun platform. These virtues destroyed German bombers far more effectively than aesthetic appeal ever could. The Battle of Britain Memorial at Cape La Fern overlooks the English Channel, honoring the 2,937 aircrew from 17 nations who served in fighter command during those crucial months. The memorial features a seated pilot gazing toward France, but no specific aircraft type. This inclusive symbolism acknowledges what the evidence demonstrates. Victory required both Spitfires and Hurricanes, operating in complementary roles according to their respective strengths. Yet if one were to apportion credit based purely on enemy aircraft destroyed, the Hurricane deserves the larger share. The final lesson of the Hurricane story extends beyond military history into questions about how societies remember and commemorate their past. The Spitfire mythology persists not because historians dispute the facts, but because popular memory resists revision. Once established, historical narratives acquire cultural momentum that facts alone cannot overcome. The Hurricane pilots might have claimed 60% of the kills, but the Spitfire claimed 100% of the mythology. In the court of public opinion, that disparity has proven remarkably resistant to correction, reminding us that the truest history and the most popular history are not always the same thing. The Hawker Hurricane saved Britain, while the Supermarine Spitfire saved Britain's imagination, both achievements worthy of remembrance, though only one reflected numerical reality.
Prove grimly prescient. Commanders must exercise extreme caution when depth charged. The British appear to have developed coordinated attack patterns. Dunitz, himself a U-boat commander during the Great War, understood underwater warfare's deadly geometry better than most. He ordered tactical modifications, deeper dives, more aggressive evasion, and absolute wireless silence during attacks. These countermeasures came too late for U-501. On the 1st of October, 1941, Walker's escort group was shepherding convoy OS-4 from Liverpool toward Freetown when Marigold's ASDIC operator detected a submarine shadowing the convoy's port flank. Oberleutnant Sir C. Hugo Farster, commanding U-501, was young, just 26, and aggressive. Having sunk 4 Allied ships in his first 2 patrols, his confidence proved fatal. Following Walker's no-refined procedure, Stork served as directing ship, while Convolvulus, under Lieutenant Commander Gordon Peyton, crept into attack position. Farster detected Convolvulus's approach too late, executing a crash dive that took U-501 to 300 feet, dangerously deep, beyond the rated crush depth. But Farster gambled that the British wouldn't set charges for such depths. He gambled wrong. Peyton's pattern, adjusted based on the extreme depth reading, placed 2 charges at 250 feet and 4 at 300 feet. The detonations crushed U-501's after compartment, flooding the engine room and jamming the diving planes in the full dive position. The submarine plunged past 400 feet before the pressure hull failed completely. Once again, there were no survivors. Once again, oil and debris marked the kill. 2 U-boats in 3 weeks. The news reached Winston Churchill during a war cabinet meeting on the 3rd of October. The Prime Minister, who had been following Walker's unconventional career with interest, sent a personal memorandum to Admiral Noble. This officer is to be given whatever resources he requires. The U-boat must be defeated, and Commander Walker appears to understand how. It was the kind of political backing that could transform a maverick into a mainstream success or set him up for a spectacular public failure. 19th of October, 1941. The true test of Walker's system came not against lone submarines, but against the Wolf Pack, the coordinated group tactics that Dunitz had perfected into a science of mass destruction. Convoy C-48, plodding westward from Halifax with 38 merchant ships, found itself targeted by Wolfpack Schley. 9 U-boats formed in a picket line stretching 200 miles across the convoy's projected route. Walker's second escort group had been reinforced, a tacit acknowledgement of his success, and now included 7 vessels: Stork, Marigold, Convolvulus, Gardenia, Pensman, Vetch, and the destroyer HMS Vanquisher. It was still woefully inadequate for protecting 38 merchantmen against 9 submarines. But it was 3 more escorts than most convoys received. The Wolfpack's initial attack came at dusk on the 19th, the Germans' preferred time. When the setting sun silhouetted targets while submarines remained invisible in the darkening water, U-432, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Hermann Eckart, struck first, torpedoing the freighter Everla. The ship, loaded with timber from Nova Scotia, actually remained afloat for 90 minutes, its buoyant cargo keeping it on the surface, even as water flooded its holds. The crew had time to abandon ship in good order, rare mercy in the North Atlantic's unforgiving environment. But Eckart's success brought the Wolf Pack swarming. Within 30 minutes, 4 more U-boats converged on the convoy, drawn by Eckart's sighting report transmitted on the secure Enigma frequency. This was the scenario Walker had wargamed repeatedly, multiple submarines attacking from different bearings, each capable of launching a spread of 4 torpedoes before diving deep. The conventional escort response was to scatter, each vessel chasing its assigned target, while the convoy fragmented into chaos. Walker chose the opposite approach. Keying his wireless transmitter, he issued rapid orders. Vanquisher and Gardenia would screen the convoy's van and flanks. Deterring surface approaches, the remaining 5 escorts would form hunter-killer pairs, with Walker himself coordinating their efforts from Stork's Bridge. It was essentially the creeping attack system scaled up to Wolfpack dimensions, turning the Germans' own coordinated tactics against them. The key was patience. Rather than rushing to depth charge every ASDIC contact, Walker's escorts would track submarines methodically, waiting for optimal attack positions, even if it meant allowing U-boats to maneuver for minutes at a time. The risk was enormous. Every minute spent setting up a perfect attack was a minute during which torpedoes might strike home. But Walker had done the mathematics. A hasty attack had an 8% kill probability. His pattern, when properly executed, had demonstrated 40% success rates in the past month's engagements. At 2100 hours, Marigold gained solid ASDIC contact on a submarine running submerged at 120 feet, bearing 090 degrees relative to the convoy. Walker detached Pensman to execute the attack, with Marigold maintaining the directing role. The U-boat, later identified as U-532 under Oberleutnant Klaus Bargstein, attempted the standard evasive pattern: deep dive, hard turn to starboard, speed reduction. Pensman's commander, Lieutenant Commander Jack Fiegel, had participated in every one of Walker's training exercises. His approach was textbook perfect: 3 knots forward speed, continuous course corrections based on Marigold's wireless updates, pattern released at the calculated optimal position. The detonations came at 2116 hours. This time, however, there was no immediate debris. The ocean boiled and settled. Oil appeared, always oil, but no conclusive evidence of a kill. Then, 40 seconds after the explosions, a different sound reached Pensman's hydrophone operator, the distinctive screech of tearing metal. Transmitted through water with crystal clarity, U-532's pressure hull, weakened by near-miss concussions, had failed during an emergency blow attempt. Bargstein had tried to surface, to save his crew, but the damaged hull couldn't withstand the rapid pressure change. The submarine broke apart at 180 feet. 22 men made it to the surface. 23 did not. The engagement lasted 7 hours. By dawn on the 20th of October, Walker's escorts had executed 11 creeping attacks against 7 different U-boats. 3 submarines were confirmed destroyed. 2 more were so heavily damaged that they were forced to break off and limp back to Lorient, effectively removed from combat for months. The convoy lost 5 merchantmen, a grievous toll, but less than half the expected casualty rate against a 9-boat wolf pack. Dunitz, reviewing the battle reports from his surviving commanders, noted with alarm, British anti-submarine effectiveness has increased markedly. Attack patterns suggest coordinated tactics and possibly new weapons. 6th of November, 1941. The ornate conference room at Derby House held an audience Walker had spent his career dreaming of and simultaneously dreading. 16 senior officers, including Admiral Noble, and representatives from the Admiralty's Tactical Division, Anti-Submarine Warfare Department, and Research and Development Section, had assembled to hear Walker present his tactical innovations. Gone was the dismissive mockery of his earlier proposals. The room's atmosphere carried the brittle tension of institutional orthodoxy, confronting undeniable results. Walker had never been comfortable with public-speaking mathematics, and tactics were his languages. Not rhetoric, but he understood the stakes. His success needed to scale beyond a single escort group. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost at an unsustainable rate. Over 300 Allied ships sunk in 1941, against fewer than 30 U-boats destroyed. If Walker's methods could be disseminated throughout the escort forces, the mathematics of attrition might finally tilt in Britain's favor. He began with the statistics, letting the numbers speak their brutal truth. In the period from 1st of September to 31st of October, the 2nd Escort Group conducted 17 depth charge attacks. 7 resulted in confirmed kills, 3 in probable kills, and 4 in heavy damage requiring the target to withdraw from combat operations. This represents a success rate of approximately 41% confirmed, 65% including probables, and 82% if we count operational mission kills. The silence that followed was profound. Captain Colin Jim Stevens, director of the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, leaned forward. "Commander, you're aware that the service-wide average for the same period was 9% confirmed kills?" "I am aware, sir, and you attribute this improvement entirely to your modified attack pattern." "Not entirely, sir. 3 factors contribute. The pattern itself, the creeping approach that allows precise positioning, and crew training in coordinated wireless tactics. Remove any one element, and effectiveness drops significantly." What followed was 3 hours of detailed technical discussion. Walker demonstrated with scale models how the diamond pattern created overlapping pressure zones. He presented hydrophone recordings from attacks, showing the distinctive acoustic signature of simultaneous versus sequential detonations. He walked through the geometry of the creeping approach, explaining why slow speed paradoxically increased attack effectiveness, despite seeming to violate basic tactical doctrine about maintaining momentum and speed. The skeptics, and there were still skeptics, raised predictable objections. Commander Philip Vian, a conventional tactician of considerable reputation, argued that the pattern's complexity made it unsuitable for rapid training of new escort commanders. "You've demonstrated success with a hand-picked, extensively drilled group," Vian said. "But we're commissioning new Corvettes every fortnight, crewed by reservists who've never seen a submarine except in newsreels. They need simple, robust tactics, not mathematical puzzles." Walker had anticipated this argument. "Sir, with respect, the issue isn't complexity, but novelty. Once internalized, the creeping attack becomes as instinctive as any other tactical procedure." Lieutenant Commander Fiel executed a perfect attack during the SC-48 engagement while under torpedo attack himself in darkness, with damaged wireless equipment. The pattern held because the underlying geometry is sound. The debate continued through lunch and into the afternoon. 2 camps emerged: progressives who saw Walker's methods as the potential solution to the convoy crisis, and conservatives who worried about disrupting established procedures during wartime. The meeting broke with no firm conclusions, but Admiral Noble pulled Walker aside afterward. "You've made believers of enough of them," Noble said quietly. "We'll authorize expanded trials. We'll receive 8 more escort vessels, and permission to establish a training program at Tobermory. But understand, Commander, if your next convoy goes badly, the knives will be out. Success has given you credibility, but one disaster will brand you a dangerous innovator who got lucky a few times. Walker understood perfectly. He had moved from the periphery to the spotlight, and spotlights illuminated failures as brilliantly as they did successes. The training program began on the 15th of November at the Royal Navy base at Tobermory. On the Isle of Mull, Walker insisted on teaching the course himself, despite having command responsibilities. Over 3 intensive days, escort commanders learned the creeping attack through repetition and simulation. Walker had arranged for a retired submarine, HMS H-31, to serve as a mobile training target. Commanders practiced the painstaking approach, the wireless coordination, the split-second timing of pattern release. Not everyone succeeded immediately. Lieutenant David Eames, assigned to the newly commissioned Corvette, HMS Arbutus, struggled with the slow-speed ship handling required for the approach. On his 4th practice run, Eames lost control in a quartering sea and nearly rammed the submarine. Walker, watching from Stork, transmitted a message that became legendary in escort circles. Eames, your mathematics are perfect, and your ship handling resembles a drunken walrus. We'll work on the latter. By the end of the training period, Eames had mastered the technique and would go on to sink 2 U-boats the following spring. 3rd of December, 1941. Winter in the North Atlantic transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a strategic challenge into a test of human endurance. Waves 40 feet high, winds exceeding gale force for days at a time, visibility measured in yards rather than miles. These conditions would have been dangerous enough without enemy submarines hunting in the darkness. The smaller corvettes, designed for coastal work and pressed into ocean convoy duty through desperate necessity, pitched and rolled with such violence that crews couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't remain at their stations without lashing themselves in place. Walker's expanded 2nd Escort Group now numbered 15 vessels, making it one of the largest dedicated anti-submarine formations in the Royal Navy. The group had been assigned to the Western Approaches Commands, its most hazardous duty, the Gibraltar Run, where convoys passed through U-boat patrol zones concentrated around the Bay of Biscay. Dönitz had reinforced these areas with his most experienced commanders, creating what German submariners called the Death Zone, 200 miles where attack was almost guaranteed. On the 5th of December, convoy HG-76 departed Gibraltar, 32 merchantmen carrying war materials from North Africa and the Mediterranean. Walker's intelligence briefing warned of 8 U-boats definitely positioned along the route, possibly more. The weather forecast was equally grim, a major storm system moving east-northeast. With winds forecast at force 9 and seas building to 30-foot swells, the Germans struck on the first night before the storm arrived in full force. U-537, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Peter Shrew, torpedoed the cargo ship Rucking at 2200 hours. The vessel's bow disintegrated, and she went down in 4 minutes. The destroyer HMS Stanley, on the convoy's port flank, picked up 17 survivors from the freezing water. Walker immediately implemented his tactical response, rather than charging toward the torpedo track in the traditional counterattack. He positioned 3 escorts Stork, Marigold, and Convolvulus, a triangular formation around the estimated attack position. The triangle's geometry allowed simultaneous ASTIC coverage from multiple bearings, making it nearly impossible for a submarine to slip away undetected. Convolvulus gained contact first, a solid echo at 1,000 yards. Bearing 270 degrees, depth estimated at 150 feet. But before Walker could initiate a creeping attack, the storm arrived. Within 15 minutes, wind speed doubled, seas turned chaotic, and visibility dropped to near zero. The carefully choreographed coordination that made Walker's pattern so effective suddenly became nearly impossible to execute. Walker faced a grim choice. Attempt the attack in conditions that made precise wireless coordination and slow-speed maneuvering extremely hazardous. Or break off and accept that U-537 would remain a threat to the convoy. He chose to attack. "If we wait for perfect conditions," he said to his first lieutenant, "the submarines will sink every ship we're meant to protect." The engagement that followed tested every assumption about Walker's system. Marigold, serving as directing ship, fought to maintain a stick contact as 30-foot swells lifted her hull partially clear of the water, causing the Aztec dome to lose contact during each wave trough. Stork, creeping forward at 3 knots, struggled to maintain steerage as quartering seas pushed her bow off course. On the bridge, Walker compensated manually, issuing rapid helm corrections based on his intuitive grasp of the submarine's likely position. At 2332 hours, Stork released her pattern. The detonations came irregularly. The storm had scattered the depth charges during their descent, disrupting